So my role today, and really looking forward to hearing Sue, and also before I start, I'd like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the traditional owners of the many different lands on which we're meeting today. My role today is to set some context for the discussion, certainly in the Australian context, but I'm sure relevant for any overseas people on board. It'll be relevant as well. So first of all, just to let everyone know, if we can go to the next slide, what the Workplace Gender Equality Agency is. We're a federal statutory body. Many of you in senior roles in boards and CEOs will have already dealt with us or hopefully seen some of our reports. But in Australia, every employer with 100 or more employees is required to report to us annually on a range of gender equality indicators. We cover nearly 5 million employees, over 12,000 employers. And there's a requirement to report that information also that the company provides. The company needs to also inform employees and shareholders and unions in relation to the report and how they can access that information. There's also minimum standards for larger companies in relation to having policies and strategies, and they're basically a non-event. So, and I'll just touch on some of the reform that's happening at the end of my presentation too, and those minimum standards are one of those areas. And the leverage we have is that companies that are non-compliant can be publicly named and also cannot have access to some government tenders and grants, which is you know, an important catalyst for reporting on gender equality. And then we provide information back because the data is really just the first step in terms of, you know, what are the insights, how does a company benchmark against their industry, and ideally highlighting opportunities for improvement. So just to go, if we go next slide, just to go to the state of play at the moment. And at the moment from our numbers, and I know that slide's very small, but it's basically all of the 18 or 19 industries and how they rank in relation to their gender pay gap. And we use the gender pay gap obviously as the proxy for how we're going on gender equality. And on our calculation, which is total remuneration on a full-time equivalent, so we annualise part-time and casual roles, the gender pay gap is 22.8%. And it has been coming down every year over the last 8 years, but the pace of change is very, very slow. And what we do see here just on the right-hand side of the slide is some of those high industries: construction sector, financial services, professional, scientific and technical services. You know, the financial services was industry was very pleased this year because for the first time they weren't the highest gender pay gap. And if you look to that right-hand column, over the last 8 years, they've actually brought down their gender pay gap by 9.2% because of concerted action trying to address the issue. So for the first time, the construction sector is actually the highest, and in fact, they've gone up over the last 12 months. If we go to the next slide, what we see as and the evidence shows is doing a pay gap analysis is absolutely fundamental to understanding your pay gap and what you can do to drive that change. And here just shows industries that are doing pay gap analysis and also who's taking action as a result. So you can see there the financial insurance services industry, the highest proportion in terms of doing that work of analysing gender pay gaps, but also reasonably high in terms of taking action. And what we do see in many cases is companies are doing pay gap analysis and then saying, oh, well, we got what we expected, or we're limited in terms of what we can do to drive change, therefore we're not going to do anything even though we know where the issues are. And that's a real challenge, and obviously that's not going to address and bring down the gender pay gap over time. So if we go to the next slide, this is the current workforce composition, and once again, it's medium and large businesses. It's about close to a 50-50 split in terms of the workforce. For the first time in this data set, we had over 40% of managers are women. So we have got increases, and the increase in promotion of women is, you know, is actually well over 50%, which is the reason why those numbers are going up slowly over time. But you can see very clearly as we progress up the seniority scale how the numbers of women significantly diminish to less than 20% of CEOs are women. So if we go to the next slide, we've also tried to look at the combination of gender pay gaps and workforce composition in quartiles. And we like this analysis just to try and dig a little bit deeper underneath that says, okay, this shows that men are twice as likely to be in the highest quartile as women. And if you look to the bottom quartile, women are 50% more likely to be in that lowest quartile. And this isn't, this is annualizing, once again, part-time and casual salaries. So we've got a like-to-like comparison of annual total remuneration. And interestingly, the gender pay gaps aren't that different for the three bottom quartiles, but the gender pay gap differential in that top quartile is very substantial, and combined with the composition issues is driving a lot of the gender pay gap within industries and overall. And this is some of the analysis that over time we'll be doing for companies as well as for industries. If we have a look at the next slide, just a state of play of board composition. Currently, the big improvement over time, once again, but still high, levels of concern. So 74% of boards have over 60% men, and in fact, 22% of boards have no women at all. Still very high, down from 37% 5 or 6 years ago, but still quite substantial. Women are 1 in 3 on the board and 1 in 5 of chairs. And once again, the evidence shows that when you have gender diversity and diversity at your board level and at your senior executive level, your capacity to drive down the gender pay gap is enhanced, but also there's a positive and causal relationship between women in senior executive positions and value, productivity and profitability of companies. And that's some research we did a couple of years ago with the Bank West Curtin Economics Centre, and it's actually the first time that a causal link between the two has been proven. Just to give you an idea, we've been talking a lot about parental leave, federal budget obviously highlighted if we go to the next slide, just to give you an idea of the state of play of gender equality in parental leave. 60% of companies are offering access to parental leave, and over 90% of that 60% offer it equally to either men or women. It's interestingly and understandable because of the cost, larger companies are much more likely to be able to offer it than smaller. But interestingly, a lot of the growth in parental leave over recent years has been in that 500 to 1,000 size company, who are starting to see it as a real requirement of the job and a real point of competitive advantage and differentiation for their staff. Also, interestingly, in the state of the national debate, of employers who are offering parental leave, 4 in 5 are also paying superannuation on that parental leave, and 7% of them are actually paying super on the government's leave as well. And obviously there's going to be an ongoing national debate about whether the government should be paying super on their PPL. Interestingly, once again, a small number of companies are taking that initiative themselves to pay super on the unpaid leave that's covered by the government scheme. Now, obviously, today's discussion is not just about gender, which is, but from a broader diversity perspective as well. And if we just go to the next slide, some of the work that we're now doing to try and get a more nuanced and detailed view in terms of being able to analyse our data, not just on a gender basis, but across other aspects, is for the first time we've collected data on age. And we've now been able to say, well, what's the life cycle in terms of employment and what does that mean for pay differentials and a gender pay gap? Once again, gender pay gap at every level, even those under 24s, there's still a 2.5% gender pay gap, but it increases over time. It really spreads at that sort of 30s point, early 30s point of view, where women are making choices about family responsibilities and caring and those sorts of things, and potentially not returning to the workforce. And you can see how that gap widens, particularly in those peak earning years of 45 to 64. Very substantial in terms of it, and good to get a bit more detail. If you go to the next slide, what we haven't yet been able to do is do our analysis on the basis of things like indigeneity, if someone has people with a disability, people from cultural and linguistically diverse backgrounds. We did do some analysis and work with the Diversity Council and the Jumbana Institute in relation to Aboriginal women from a little bit of information that we had. And what you do see is not only differential results and inequality, Aboriginal men and women compared in the workplace, but that women's experience, Aboriginal women's experience of the workplace is even substantially more challenging than Aboriginal men. So there's some early work, and if people are interested in this, I would direct you to have a look at this Gary Yala work that has been done. If we go to the next slide, I just want to flag for everyone that all our data is available publicly on our Data Explorer, which is on our website, and you can go there and have a look at your own company, have a look at how you compare to your industry, have a look at other industries, and all sorts of information is available there. Next slide. We do use this information to do a lot of research. And as I've mentioned, there's that causal link. And once again, I'd refer you to our website if you're interested in reading the research report about that link of women in leadership to productivity and value. If we go to the next slide, we've also recently released some information that we do every couple of years with KPMG and the Diversity Council as well about, well, what's driving the gender pay gap, what sits behind this, and what they've been able to, KPMG does the analysis using HILDA data, so it's a different data set but supplemented with ours, that shows that there's 3 key causes of the gender pay gap. It's driven by the industrial and occupational segregation that we have, the roles that we have, and the industries that we work in, and the fact that Australia has a highly gender segregated industrial structure, in fact, one of the highest in the OECD, and that's driving a significant portion of our gender pay gap. The fact that obviously women take time out of the workforce for care and family responsibilities and are often, in fact, our recent research has shown that no more than 50% of women at any stage are working full-time, but also just the broader gender discrimination and bias makes a big difference. And just to go to the last slide, Brad, if you can pop onto that, I just wanted to flag what's coming down the pipeline in terms of changes, because the government's reviewed our Act, and we haven't been able to, but we will now be publishing, or shortly, once the legislation's passed, which it's being drafted at the moment, publish employer-level gender pay gaps. We've been limited from doing that previously. That's something that's happened in the UK 5 years ago, and we're watching with interest. There seems to have been some positive movement on the gender pay gap as a result. There's going to be new minimum standards requiring large employers to set targets and take action rather than just report to us. There's a requirement to act and actually make those improvements. So in terms of delivering some improved performance in terms of gender equality, we're going to be collecting additional diversity data so that we can do that nuanced analysis. Through Kate Jenkins' Respect at Work report, we will be collecting more information on sexual harassment and bullying. So the reporting requirements are going to be higher for companies, which will hopefully back up the actions that are being required and taken as a result of Kate's work. We're also collecting from the federal public sector and working with the states and territories, which will substantially expand our data set, but also enable a much deeper analysis and do those comparisons public to private sector. And as an organisation ourselves, we're re-skilling to work directly with employers, with you, to drive change and how we can support that change, not just being the data agency, but using the data and information as a tool to work together to improve on gender equality. So happy to go into any of the details. We'll go over to Sue. I'll hand back to Julia, but hopefully that's given you a bit of a lay of the land of where we're at in Australia in terms of the data, in terms of the actions that are required, and you know, all with the aspiration and the drive to improve gender equality in workplaces.
Thank you, Mary. That's a very thorough and really insightful overview of where we're at in this country at the moment. I'm really excited to be able to hand over to Sue now, because hopefully she'll be having some brilliant ideas and tips to share with people about how we can make some significant progress. So over to you, Sue.
And thanks, Julia. It's 7:20 in the morning. I'm going to do my best, but manage expectations. Mary, thank you so much for that. Crikey, what a fascinating insight around the numbers. I'm going to talk about words, deeds, and actions. So what is going to move the needle? And a tiny little bit about I&D at Odgers, because we're really proud of what we do, and I want to show you how we are moving the needle, and we are on a journey, and there's more to do. And I've put at the end rude Q&As. That's basically just to say, you can ask anything you want to. And if I can't answer, I will go away and get a response within 24 hours. And I have a feeling Mary will have some fantastic responses too. So that's coming at the end. Next slide, please, Fred. So just click through. So I talked to lots of people about this topic, and what I'm finding, particularly over in Europe and North America, is people's job titles are expanding incredibly. We've now people who now do diversity, equity, and inclusion. I've seen well-being, and I've seen belonging as well. And so I just wanted to really quickly kind of make sure we define the difference. And there's one more at the bottom. Keep going, Brad. So in terms of, just to be clear, the diversity is the what? Anything that can be measurable in terms of our specific demographics, you measure it. It's how we're all different. And quite often you hear people say, oh, we need a diverse candidate. I'm like, well, pick the next person on the street, because every single one of us is diverse, because everyone is made up of unique characteristics of our skills, knowledge, background, experience, knowledge, perspectives. We're all unique. The magic really happens when we do the inclusion. This is where you bring your whole self to work. And Catalyst used the word belongingness or uniqueness. So all these fantastic parts which make you unique, you bring everything to work. You don't hide everything. And so this is where the workplace really benefits in terms of challenge, innovation, perspectives, creativity, etc. But the new one we'll talk a lot about is about equity. So I was brought up very much believing in equality. You treat everybody the same. That's fair. But now there's a recognition, well, no, that's not fair, because you need to treat people differently to get to the same outcome. I think that's a real mindset shift from equality to equity, so everyone can achieve their potential. You give them what they need. There's an expression, equality is giving everybody a pair of shoes. Equity is where everybody has a pair of shoes that fits. I think we can really see the difference there in terms of why is it important. So I just wanted to make sure we're all different in the terminology. Next slide, please, Brad. So Mary talked about the business case. I mean, it's just been around for a long time and continues to get stronger and stronger. The research historically has been very much around gender. We've now got ethnicity in the mix. And I'm really looking forward to seeing a lot more really strong research around LGBTQ+ representation, people of different abilities. I think the more data we have, because obviously with GDPR compliance, it's so important that we ask people in a safe way. But the more data we have, the more we can show. And here's some, Mary, it was great to see some examples from Australia where there's a direct causation. But here we have around business performance. But I'm sure you've heard about it from talent retention and attraction, creativity, innovation, stakeholder expectations, matching the clients. I mean, there are many, many reasons. So let's just keep going, because you're here because you know that topic. Brad, thank you. So let's talk about how you're going to make a difference in the organization. So in any change initiative, you tend to find that you've got this spectrum. On the left-hand side, you've got the active resistance. If you've ever read the book about My Iceberg is Melting, these are the no-nos. And so this is usually about 5, historically used to be up to 10% of an organization. And they can suck energy out of you. It's like the demented in an organization. We all know who they are. It's like, oh, it's never going to work, and didn't work last time. And they still exist, but I'm just really pleased they're getting smaller and smaller, particularly around this topic. To the other side, the right-hand side, you've got the enthusiastic advocates. And I'm sure a lot of them are on this call today because you're fascinated by this topic. You just get it. You have inherent diversity and inclusion. You just know it's important and it's part of how you are as a human being to just make it happen. And my challenge is people like the enthusiastic advocates are the first ones to put their hands up to be a mentor, to come to events, to speak at panels, and which is fantastic. But actually the people we have to move are the quiet middle. And you tend to have about 80% of your organization in the middle. These are really good people. They are working hard, they're delivering what they need to do, but they're kind of focusing on, this is my job, this is someone else's problem. And it's to really engage that quiet middle. Because if you can get them to shift to the right, this is where suddenly there's a cultural shift in your organization. It's kind of like going over a cliff or a waterfall. Suddenly there's this massive momentum, and you really unleash the capability of the masses in your organization. So let's talk about unleashing, moving the quiet middle, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. In terms of thinking, we've got a lot of research around left and right brain thinkers. You've got the analytical side and you've got the more creative side. And so it's basically having a different strategy to engage everybody, but it's about the head, the heart, and the hands. Because to me, the people you need to move, I find the hardest ones to get are the left brain thinkers, the analytical. And so this is where the importance of data and evidence. And this is where you're looking at, for example, and I'm stereotyping here, your finance director, your sales director, your ops director, usually people who have P&L responsibility. And so what they say is important. People look to them in terms of setting the strategy for the organization. It's getting them on board. And so I talk a lot about data and evidence. Mary had some fantastic evidence there. And then you can get it for your organization. So let's talk about shifting the quiet middle to the right through words, deeds, and actions. Brad, if you wouldn't mind moving over a slide for me. So let's start off with words. There's a great expression, you need to see it to believe it. You also need to hear it to believe it. And so people are looking around all the time in terms of for culture and social cues. What is the right thing to say and do here? It starts off with what you decide to wear when you go into the office, who you decide to sit to when you're having your lunch, who you say hello to in the morning, who you offer to make coffee to. You as leaders have an incredible responsibility in terms of the words that you use, what is acceptable in the language. There's a big campaign at the moment about aggression and harassment towards women. And it's, you've got, blokes playing football, teenagers, and one's wolf whistling to a girl walking past. And one of his mates says, no, stop. It's not acceptable anymore, mate. Come on, your sister's that age. And it's just recognizing that the words we use are so important. And if there's anything inappropriate, just to really shut it down in the moment, in terms of we're not then asking women to speak up on behalf of other women. It was interesting, Mary was talking about Indigenous population. What happens is people who are in a minority tend to be asked so much to speak up and represent their minority. Tell me about your lived experience. Why is it challenging? And it's another part of their day job, but it's not in their objectives. So if they spend 5-10% being an ambassador, then someone else is getting 5 to 10% more time in their workplace. So when you're comparing their performance, you're not saying, oh, but you spoke at 20 conferences, you've mentored 10 people. And so just be aware that you have to, it's equity, because you're asking someone to do that job, then take away something else. And so then everyone is assessed on an equal playing field. So the first thing I really need you to do, and this is why it's so great the CEO is on there, is make I&D a business priority. And that means treating it like a business issue. So you put it on the business agenda for every agenda. If you think what you do, I'm sure a number of you sell products and services. And so you tend to find how much have we sold? What's our customer service? What's our profitability? What's our resourcing strategy? What are the customer insights? This is exactly the same. Treat it as a business priority. And so find 1 or 2 KPIs that are linked to the business and make sure it's on everybody's agenda. It's talked about. And so it's not a fad. Quite often I find this topic is like, oh, we've got a new CEO, she really wants this. Whereas, in a year's time, it's like, oh, it's dropped off a bit. It has to be in the business as usual. And so, where you can, put it in the business agenda. When you're talking about this, to shift the quiet middle, in the UK, to be frank, there's quite a lot of backlash around gender. And so people particularly men of a certain age, for example, we know it's much harder over 50 plus. I'm like, well, what's in it for me now? It's all for women. And to me, this is then taking the conversation backwards. And so by having a really broad discussion around diversity, what that means, we look at cognitive diversity. Are you an introvert, an extrovert? What kind of learning style do you have? Are you an activist, a theorist? Are you a reflector, a pragmatist? Suddenly everyone can relate to one part of diversity because everybody has a story. And so really think facts tell, but stories sell. And so, you know, I do storytelling training for leaders, and you might think, what the hell has that got to do with diversity and inclusion? But trust me, I've been to hundreds of conferences hearing people talk about this. I never remember, oh, we moved it from 20 to 22%. I remember leaders who talk about personal stories, about what's happened to their family, their colleagues, and how they've had such a massive wake-up call. So really find your story and coach your leaders to tell a story. How in 3 minutes can you get people to realize that, oh yes, this is really important to you, it's touched you? Because you have to be authentic. I remember I used to work at Nestle. I was the chief diversity officer at Nestle, and I would coach the lead, you know, the board when they'd go and talk on panels about this. And they'd have their stories, their set stories. And you can watch them going, that's good, but you can see it's like almost scripted. And when they were asked a question and would open up about their personal stories, it was just incredible. And so just challenge yourself in terms of, you know, imagine you're learning something, but then you have a natural response. And so we shifted to not doing any coaching, just be who you are and tell your stories. So facts tell, get stories sell. You need to really speak up in terms of publicly supporting people who need the support. There's a big thing around allyship, because you actually are supporting one group of people. And it's like, well, hang on, it isn't inclusion for everybody. And yes, it is. But allyship is recognizing there's some groups who need support more than others. Because if you're in the majority, if you are the dominant group in an organization, you are setting how things are done. Because you sign off the policies, you write the policies. You know, historically, for example, around pensions, it was never included same-sex couples. You know, Mary mentioned about parenting leave. You know, historically, it was just about the mum, maternity. But now we talk about paternity, and we talk about primary and secondary carers. We talk about adoption leave for same-sex couples or other situations. And so, you know, really speak up and speak out for other people who perhaps don't have a voice at the table. And so, and sometimes it will feel uncomfortable because, you know, you're pushing yourself out of your comfort zone. But in really to do the research and recognize in a position of power and influence, you can change things for everybody else. So also publicly support it, you know, going on pride marches, having the lanyards, having the mugs. It has such an impact to show people that they can come to you. You are a safe place to go and talk to about issues. You know, go and talk at events, talk on webinars, talk on panels, but also refuse to talk on single gender panels, all men or all women, in terms of we need diversity of different input and conversation and challenge and perspectives. The other one I had was stay. I know it needs to be in all the actions, but quite often CEOs will come and launch a conference on women, which is fantastic. You know, we want women leaders, we're investing in this, we're doing this, we're doing that. And then they will talk for 10 minutes and bugger off. Because obviously people are busy, but actually the biggest thing you can do is stay. Because this is where you talk to people, you get their insights. And this is what I talk about, you have to see it to believe it. Because then you recognize, wow, you're a really busy person. You spent a day with us. Wow, that's incredible. We matter to you. And so talk the walk and walk the talk. And I don't know if any of you been on a panel where you've been asked, oh, and the first question, how did you manage to, being a mum and traveling in your career? I've never seen a man ask that. And so this is also, think about the words that you're using and being equitable. So if you ask a woman, ask a man that too. And I think it'd be quite fascinating, the different journeys people have been on and their coping strategies. So really lead by example, and hopefully I've given a few things there that you can do. So on to the next one, please, Brad. Thank you. Deeds. So a deed to me is when you sign when you buy a house, you sign the deeds of the house. So it's pretty important. It's a big thing. It's like a commitment. And so I've talked about, you know, really treat I&D as a business issue. So I don't know about you, if you're in, you know, if you're in product design, development, if you're in FMCG banking, we're all selling a product or providing a product and service to somebody. And so you treat it as a business issue. So if you're in, for example, FMCG, you are here to make products. So you invest a lot in marketing. What's your route to market? How are you going to make this product? Yeah, there's a budget behind that. There's a team given to it. It's their job, and they have very specific measurables of what they need to do to measure success. Quite often I find in D&I, oh, we've asked for volunteers and they're going to kind of do it at the side of their desk, and we've given them £5,000. Aren't we doing well? And you're like, no, actually that isn't going to shift the needle. So I want to know who's resourcing it, who are they reporting to, what KPIs they're measured on, and what resources are you giving them? And also, how is everyone going to be held accountable through the organisation? And I've got some interesting research to show you in a minute around that. So give D&I a budget, not volunteers. But also, you know, for example, the things that you can do is when you get given a project team, so okay, here's the project team, here are people going to the next conference, for example, look at it and just say, no, it's not diverse, and give it back. And so suddenly people are realizing, wow, you really are serious about this, because that impacts on, you know, that's more time, that's a different decision, it's more budget. And so, yeah, it's definitely pushing back when things are like, no, that's just not acceptable. Sign off business I&D goals. And so everybody in the business needs to have a link to this. Quite often that's why I ask who has responsibility. It sits in HR, because actually it's all about recruitment and promotion. Well, a lot of it is that, but actually every single line manager has a responsibility. They make the final call when you recruit somebody, and every employee is responsible for the culture, the inclusion people feel when they join an organization. So write it into the performance management. It's not about the what, it's the how too. You know, if you're in marketing, well, what percentage increase of market share are you going to get from certain communities which are underrepresented in our sales perspective? You know, how are you going to put that in safety if you're in manufacturing? Because there's a proven correlation between the diversity of a team, the inclusion, the psychological safety, and the LTIFR rate, your safety rate. And so make it a business priority by embedding it into business KPIs. And you need to have a bit of a translation ability here. So when I was at Nestle, I had talked very differently to the head of engineering, to the head of marketing. So they had very different challenges, but actually they had different KPIs, but it was doing the right thing, which was moving the needle. And I heard a great expression from General McAllister. He talked about, you can't move something that's not moving. If you think about a ship and you want to move a direction, you actually can't shift it unless it is moving. And so quite often you just need to start, you need to act. And if it's not quite right, then constantly just shift and adjust, just like you're steering a boat. You know, you have constant little tweaks moving forward. So I talk, and so D, to define accountability, everybody's responsible. Yes, HR have to do this. Yes, I have to do this, but this is how you are responsible. I talk about 3 action plans: the I, the we, the you. So what am I going to do? What are we as an organization going to do? And what are you as individuals going to do? Never more than 3, because that's all I can remember. Do things like, you know, if there's a diversity council, chair it. Go to every meeting and cancel other things to be there. It just shows so important that this is important to you. It's a business issue. Oh, sorry. Can you do the next slide? I'm furiously clicking, wondering why it's not working. So I say have a killer slide. I remember at Nestle, I had 1 slide, and I did this for every single business leader where they were. So on the left-hand side, you've got junior grades. Level G is an employee level, going up through supervisor, F, to manager at E, to director at D, etc. And also then you've got the percentage up the y-axis. And it was fascinating. I didn't see a single function where it had equality, parallel lines between men and women at every level. There was always a cliff, and it was usually in favor of men, but there were some functions where it wasn't. And so this is always something to get the conversation started, because it's evidence-based. No one can say, oh, yeah, but look around the room, we've got lots of diversity. And you're like, yeah, but what jobs, what functions, what levels? As Mary was saying, women tend to cluster. We call them staff roles. So this is where, for example, it's in HR and marketing, where you're managing big teams. Whereas if you think who gets to the top, it's those who are in line roles, who have profit and loss responsibility. It's the sales people who go to be general managers, who then become the MDs and the CEOs. And so, you know, look at where women are working in your organization, as well as what level they are. Next slide, please. So let's talk about actions then. So we've talked about giving people accountability. So ask leaders for an update on their numbers. I almost have a little bit of competition. I would have like a little graph by name. What was your representation, but also what was the change we had in the last quarter? So really think about the timing of your KPIs. These are not annual KPIs. You know, I can't get excited about an annual KPI. We measure sales every week, every day, every minute. I'm not suggesting that, but you know, it's definitely monthly or quarterly at the longest. And so, and communicate it to everybody. This isn't a secret you're going to keep. You need to talk about it. And I call about it, it's not a marathon, it's a series of sprints. Because there'll be other business priorities, I understand that, but you have to keep going, and you need drinks and snacks, because it's sprints, but over marathon distance. It is a journey. I've been working on this for, I don't know, 15, 20 years. I learn something new every day. It's constantly evolving, the language, the legislation. And so drinks and snacks are really important. Think about going up and down beyond the four walls of your organization in terms of your communities, with your suppliers, with your clients, with the education system around you. Because again, that's where you're engaging more with the quiet middle. Because there are so many people you'll find who do volunteering or community work outside of your organization. So how can you engage them to engage even more in what they're passionate about? Because if you find and work on people's passions, this is where suddenly you unleash, because they perhaps have been struggling to find £1,000 for the kids' football kind of shirts or something, and suddenly you're kind of enabling them to do what they're really passionate about, and so they also give back to your organisation. So it's this kind of virtual circle. So try and expand beyond the four walls of your organisation, up and down the value chain. And on that, think of your stakeholders, think of your investors, your suppliers. Prioritise meetings with minority suppliers. Have a diversity supplier policy in terms of this is how we will prioritise and who we will prioritise, because it's important. Who invests in your organisation? Do you have a balanced portfolio? Is it diverse? Because then people start to realise, crikey, this is really important, because you're looking at every element of our organisation. So really expand up and down the value chain. I love the fact that a lot of you don't have HR running this. It's really important that it's a business issue and you've got the CEO engaged. And make it core to the ongoing success of your organisation. It's business as usual. It's how we operate. Next slide, please, Brad. I talked about accountability. Some really interesting research from McKinsey came out last year, and they looked at, well, who is responsible for D&I in their organisation? So the two colours to look at, you've got a box on the right-hand side. The grey line is the senior leaders. To me, this is the directors and the execs. And the purple lines are the senior managers. So the first thing that hits me is, if you're a senior leader, you're twice as likely to have responsibility for this in terms of sharing the results with the organisation, having it as part of your performance reviews, and offering financial incentives. And so to me, it's, well, how can we make that, the purple and the grey lines, the same? Because it's not a senior leadership issue, it's everybody's issue. And what's interesting is I find the senior managers and the managers are a permafrost in the organisation. In terms of, you think the policies and directives coming down, all the execs know because they've had to sign them off. And when the managers tend to be absolutely overwhelmed because they've got this, they're stuck in the middle. I call it the permafrost. It's quite hard for everything to filter through that level to go to the organisation. So make the managers more accountable, but give them the skills to do that. You can't just suddenly give someone a KPI without the understanding of how I treat people equitably. What are the inclusive leadership behaviours? What does diversity actually mean? Because to me, it just means those two things. And so you have to do a lot of education as well in terms of what this means. So think about making everybody accountable for progress, and interesting about financial incentives to make progress. I know we can talk about quotas and how different people feel, but to me, I'm interested in what my boss is interested in. So I think we can do an awful lot at the bottom. And next slide, please, Brad. So Mary mentioned the gender pay gap. I've just put a couple of slides here about the UK. And so we've been measuring this for 5 years now. It's for all organisations who have 250 employees or over. And every year we get more and more organisations who come into it. So we're down now to about 14%. And so, again, a lot more to do. But there's a number of things as how different it is. So this one's by region in the UK. It's by area. And so you can just see how different it is. So on the right-hand side, the little blue bubble was where it started in 1997. So that's before we had specific company data, but you could look at it geographically and where it is today. So again, we're moving, but there's more to do. And you can see London, our capital, that's where the biggest pay gap still is. And so if you go to the next slide, please. I pulled these two out. What was interesting is, Mary said slightly different data. The left-hand one is around who is at the bottom 10% earners and the top 10% earners. What's the difference? And you can see there again with the lower earners, the hourly paid earners, the gender pay gap is much lower than at the higher area, but you can see it's going down every year. But also referring what Mary said around the age. And so it was interesting in Australia, your curve is far more of a bell curve. You can see here the real difference in terms of the bottom 3 decades from 18 up to age of 39. You can see it's much smaller, the gender pay gap, and it's interesting around the 30 to 39-year-olds, there's been quite a big jump in 2021. But then you look at the more senior people, and if I did this by level again, it would show that there's a much bigger age pay gap around older employees and the more senior they are. So, you know, we've all got the same challenges. So what can we do to really, you know, learn and solve this? Because I think one of the biggest things that we can do is just pay people equally. And lots of research around, for example, PwC asking the Gen Z, you know, who would you want to work for? And yes, ESG is so important. But a lot of them are saying, well, if there's a gender pay gap, I wouldn't go to that organization. Why would I? And so I think it's going to be talent critical rather than just, you know, it's been accepted for here so long. It's just not accepted by the younger generation anymore. So on to my next slide and the next slide. So very quickly, I&D at Odgers. So we're a people organization. Pretty much all we do is for people, by people. And so it's so important that we have an organization that matches our client base. So a big focus on hiring, making sure we hire people into Odgers that are representative of the country that we operate in. The biggest thing we do is the culture, giving people the skills, the knowledge and the language to have challenging conversations around this. So we invest a lot in upskilling people, and we have a festival every year. It's actually in November, where we have 10, 20, 30 events. We have experts come in, we have cooking classes, we have different dance classes. It's just getting you curious and interested about different cultures. And so every year we do something different, and that advances our knowledge. But we also have an allyship program. If you go to the next slide, there you go. We've got 10 ally groups. And so it really gives people an opportunity to link with something you feel passionate about. Over half of our workforce is a member of at least one allyship groups. And so, yeah, a huge calendar and exciting things going on. OMG is the Odgers Menopause group. And we've actually got an event next month. We've got 2 GPs coming from Spice Pair Health to talk about the menopause. So if you'd like to go, please let Julia and I go, and you'll be very welcome to come. And on that note, I think we're running out of time. Another slide. Thank you. Oh, so this is, I lead the inclusion diversity consulting practice. I help clients, we help clients around strategy, analytics and training, if you're interested. And definitely on to the next slide, which is around questions. So Julia, I'm going to hand back to you if I may.
Well, I'm watching with anticipation that Q&A box, that A box might start bouncing off quickly with some really intriguing questions. But there was a couple of that I was sent in advance, and one of them was, they were interested to hear both Sue and Mary's reflection on how quotas can actually contribute and what your view is on their impact on creating greater diversity.
I'm happy to jump in first briefly while Sue takes a breath after that great presentation. You know, we're of the view, and the research we've done is actually around targets, not quotas, but the targets work. And, you know, I think there's sort of fine lines between targets where people are held accountable for them and there's an expectation of delivery and quotas, you know, but there's a language around quotas that everyone sort of reacts to a little bit. I think, you know, it's a cultural thing within an organisation, but the evidence is that targets work. If you set targets to achieve on measures of gender equality and you hold people accountable for them in the, you know, in the way Sue's talking about in terms of KPIs throughout organisations, you set up skills and capacity to be able to deliver to them, you get better results, and companies that do that get better outcomes in terms of addressing issues of gender equality and the gender pay gap.
So I heard yeah, people don't like quotas, but they like what quotas do. And I think the other thing is how it's messaged in an organisation. I hate in Norway, it was the first country in the world to put in quotas around board representation for public companies. And the women on boards became known as golden skirts because it was like, oh, you got a path there because you're a woman. And so I think the decision to make quotas is a big one, but how it is messaged is key. Because if it's ever seen as people kind of getting a free pass into a job, that's where it's destructive. And so having very clear parameters, communication and ownership. But to me, quotas, I don't think should be forever. It's also like targets. I really hope in 20 years' time, people like me don't exist because this isn't a problem in society anymore. And so also think about perhaps, you know, that's why I think it's quite clever people have these, you know, commitments to by 2025, by 2030, because then it's almost like, well, we should have achieved it by then. We don't need it anymore. And it will be business as usual. So I can say it's a big decision, but how it's messaged, how it's owned, and how it's delivered, I think is key to its success, because the evidence shows it drives progress.
Oh, we've got a few questions popped up. So the first one is, do you have a personal view on the best way for boards to govern D&I, and whether you think the accountability should sit with boards or perhaps be the responsibility sitting with management?
Sue, do you want to kick off on that?
So I think the boards have a really big responsibility on this. It depends if it's a two-tier or a single-tier structure. I think the advisory boards, I think it's important that they talk about it, they recognize it, but to me it's the exec, the people who run the company. That's where the ultimate decision point lies. And so to me, it's on their agenda. It's almost saying, if we have 10 things we talk about, this is one of them. It's on every quarter, and asking people within the organization to come and present on it. And so rather than having the HRD perhaps present, having the different areas, because then they have to get up to speed. Because if you're presenting to your CEO, then frankly, you will know. I think what's also really interesting is getting the boards to do different sponsoring, reverse mentoring. That's been very successful to bring them much closer to this topic and to improve their knowledge and language on it. And so to me, the ultimate accountability sits with boards. However, what's so important is there is a accountability structure in the organization. And like we saw from the research, quite often it sits at exec and director, but then tends to get lost through the organization. It is everybody's accountability to make sure when people join, they feel welcome, they feel part of it, everyone feels psychologically safe, they can be who they are, that they don't have to hide any part of them. And so to me, ultimate accountability sits at the top, but be very clear it is woven into the framework and the fabric of accountability and the culture in the organization, and make sure people are measured and rewarded on it.
And I think from my synthesis maybe of what Sue just said is, from our perspective, gender equality needs to be a core part of the business strategy. And you need to treat it like all other aspects of your business strategy in terms of, your people there and the equality in relation to their experiences and opportunities, like you treat sales and finance and the other aspects. So, as it's not just a nice to have that sits alongside, it's a core part of strategy. And that's when it becomes embedded, the culture changes, and you then have accountability from the CEO to the board's having oversight of it, but it's being delivered by the CEO and the team.
Thank you. That's great. So I think this question is probably a little bit more to you, because the comment is, I note in your slide about the pay gaps across UK regions, 1997 and now, in Northern Ireland, women are paid more than men. Is this a great news story for women or a reflection of a bad news story for men? So, if you have any insights on that data?
No, I don't. I'm just looking at it now going, crikey, why is that? So that's one of those ones where I'll go away and do my research, and I will come back to Julia. Because, you're right, it's a unique one, and it needs to be one or the other. It could be what the segments are, the main employee structures. I don't know. I'll go and find out.
But a good little example of where that can have a negative impact is recently, and we also calculated gender pay gap on the ABS's average weekly earnings stats twice a year. In the last one, the gender pay gap went up. Women's participation went up, but the pay gap went up. And the reason is the participation for women was all in the retail sector, which is a lower paying sector. So we had more women being paid lower salaries, which drove the gender pay gap up. So sometimes you do have those perverse effects where you've got good thing on the front of participation, but its impact because of the nature of the industry and a lower paying role had a poor impact on the gender pay gap.
We've got a really great comment here. Clearly, we do have people in the construction industry that recognise that female participation is really low. And I believe the industry's got a 40% target on that. But the problem they're facing here is women are not available. We're all either all we're doing is actually pinching from one another. And it's causing a massive issue in the industry and not really moving things forward. Do you have any thoughts and comments around that?
I think so in the UK, manufacturing is quite similar, I think, and it's actually, there's the lowest representation of women, it's about 18%. And also if you ask people, the university study of graduates, it's the least attractive industry for women. And I'm sure construction is very similar. And you're right, it's one of the problems. You're stealing, as an expression, you steal Peter to pay Paul. It's like, it's not helping. What we have, you're fishing in a puddle and the puddle's drying out. What we have to do is make the puddle bigger to a pond and to a lake. And this is where, to me, it's a combination of who has accountability. The government has accountability to talk about this industry, to put it into the, what's the word when it goes into the education system? Well, it has to be talked about in schools in terms of, these are the skills.
Into the curriculum.
Curriculum, that's the way I want to marry. Thank you very much. Really early, it's my excuse. But talking about it, and it's so linked to STEM, for example. And so you have to get this at primary school, because everyone's like, oh, but we go to the graduate fair. It's too late. Girls make the decision at 13 or 14 which route they're going to take. Is it humanities or is it STEM? And so we have to be talking about this earlier throughout the education system. We have to be pushing all industries, not the big ones, all people, to talk about, how are you going to sponsor this in terms of, do you go to a school? Do you offer kids to come and look around? Do you have people go and talk about it? Do you have better apprenticeship programs at different levels? Sadly, it's not something that's overnight fixed, but it has to be this. We have to take the puddle and make it bigger. And also then thinking laterally, right now, who has the skills we need in construction? So I used to work at PwC, I read the consulting there. And I was talking to one of the finance leads about how they just were fighting over, the accountants who are coming out of university. So they looked at what are the absolute key skills you need to be an accountant. And they picked it apart, and it was, analysis, creative thinking, complex problem solving. Who else does that? And it's actually composers. And so then they're saying there was a shift of just recruiting people from finance to, we're going to take you from music degrees. And then it was like, okay, well, who else can we take? And so I'd really encourage you to think very laterally. And also, I go and talk to engineers about, oh no, we need to have a mechanical, electrical engineer in the factories. I'm like, do you? Because in chemical engineering, for example, it's nearly 50-50 the graduates. And after a bit, they're like, oh, okay, well, I can train them for 2 weeks and that's the gap that I can fill. And so really unpick what because we all have a mold. We think of a job and we automatically think of somebody in terms of the skills, in the gender, for example, we can't help it. It's this kind of imprinting. And so really pick apart your imprinting and where can I look differently? And also you've got to start building the puddle, because you're right, it's driving up the market, it's fueling, pay inequalities. There are many challenges of this, and we've got to make the puddle bigger through a number of actions. It's not just one action, it's literally education, government, industry. It's as many different things that have to work together, in my opinion. Mary, what do you think?
I completely agree. I think it is generational change, but we've also got to work out what we can do in the shorter term as well. We released some data last week on exactly this issue and focused on the construction sector, because WA has the highest gender pay gap. They've got a high concentration of construction industry in addition to mining. They've only got 16% of women in construction. In Victoria, the number's 30%, and New South Wales is 27%. So, and some of that is some of those states have set targets, and the numbers are increasing because there's that work happening, because it's driving it, and their gender pay gaps are lower as a result as well. So there's some things we can learn across the country from what's happening in different places, and to thinking a little bit differently, and telling stories. I've got a story just very quickly that I love of Kimberly Clark, who couldn't recruit anyone onto their factory floor in one of their factory towns. They couldn't get women. It was all men. They were getting 100% of applicants were men, and they looked at their job description and decided to remove the requirement of a forklift truck driver's license, because they thought we can teach that on the job rather than require it come in. The next year they had 40% of the applicants were women and 50% the year after. So sometimes we're imposing our own constraints rather than thinking about the underlying skills and capabilities and what can be trained in the position, rather than using what we've always done in the past. So I think, in the shorter term, we can really challenge our assumptions, our stereotypes, and look at how we can open those opportunities and train in the position for people who are capable.
Thank you. There's another similar question that was around any tips for industrial type companies that have a similar. So I think you probably covered most of that, but if there is any other comments, please let me know. There's a nice question here around, sharing those stories, particularly for marginalised groups, without actually asking them to share the story, because it's the additional responsibility that you actually have to give them. So how do we get the balance right so that you're not imposing that on those that are marginalised, but you are actually, you know, getting some of that visibility?
Sue, do you want to go on that? You sort of started in some of what you're presenting on that issue.
To me, it's really reaching out to allies and making it, so we do a lot of training on this is what an ally is, and these are the 5 different types of an ally. Are you a supporter, a researcher, an advocate, empathy, and something else? I'm sorry, I can't remember them all. But it's like, we will teach you on how to be an ally, because you cannot ask this person to speak up for them all the time. And so it's basically telling people this is how you're an ally, why we need allies and the different types, because not everyone can call someone out in the moment. It takes a lot of courage to actually know that's not acceptable. But there are different techniques. And so we train them on the 5 and also on the ACEs, in terms of you acknowledge a comment, but then you clarify it, you explore options, and you find a solution, because it's the impact it's had on somebody. So talking about allyship, talking about microaggressions, giving people the language and the knowledge about what they need to do. And this is where we talk about the culture, in terms of, because the problem I have is if something's always been acceptable, it's really hard to make it change. And I find with the older generation in particular, those jokes, those jibes, the banter, well, actually, that's not acceptable anymore. Then you get this whole pushback, oh, but it's really boring at work, it's so dull, Sue. I'm like, no, I'm not. I love a joke more than anybody. But I also recognize that that is offensive to some people. So maybe you want to check beforehand and recognize there are places where you can and can't say it, because this organization will not accept it anymore. And so, you know, there's some hard decisions that need to be made when perhaps someone's been a super salesperson, but actually they've been told once, they've been told twice, that's it, you're out. And usually it's a 1 strike and out, particularly in topics like this. And so I think it's making people realize that it's not just the responsibility of one segment to talk about the experiences of their segment. Yes, their lived experiences, they have to, but in terms of wider advocacy, then everyone has accountability for that. And so really focus on the allies and what you want people to do.
Now, I'm really conscious we've slightly overrun in time, but if you'll indulge me, there's one other question that I think will be, you know, good for a conversation. And it's often aspiring board members self-select out when the board is looking for diverse candidates because they can't demonstrate their credentials. Nobody wants to be a token member of a board. So where do you start if you're a board and there is no diversity on it?
I've got to say, I just think it's being intentional. It's looking harder. It's making that effort. You know, it's not taking the easy path. It's, you know, the things Sue talked about in terms of, well, a list's not acceptable unless there's some diversity on it in terms of who we're considering or who we're looking at. And, you know, I would always argue, of course, you know, on a skills basis first, but often I think the boards perpetuate because it's easy. We're going back to the same place. We're doing our friends and networks. We're, you know, recruiting in our own likeness, and it's just coming with a different perspective and trying harder because, you know, there's definitely people around who can bring that broader perspective. It's just a matter of working harder to find it.
And I would agree, Mary. We've had some extraordinary experiences where we've been really active to bring diverse communities to boards, and we've had a couple of examples where, to make sure that we didn't put the onus on one individual, they recruited in one particular case 2 Indigenous directors. So it created natural cultural safety and it created a level of diversity, but it spread the responsibility. So it was a really great example of how you managed to bring that on board. I just want to say to you both, thank you so much. You're always insightful and full of really amazing information, and it's such an important topic. I'm sure we could go on for hours asking you questions, but on behalf of all of us here in Australia, Sue, thank you for getting up so early and working with us. Someone did ask me how keen you are to potentially do some consulting over here in Australia, and I said I'm sure she'd be fine with a good cup of coffee. And Mary, thank you for sharing all the work you've been doing since you joined the agency. It's amazing to see the journey you've been on with this particular organisation, and the information that's coming out is really going to, I think when we start with data, we have such great outcomes in the future. So thank you so much. We have a little gift on its way to you, Mary. We can't do the hands at the podium and pass something little gift over to you, but there is something to say thank you so much from all of us here for your time, and thank you to everybody who's put a time aside this evening to attend. I hope it's been really valuable. We'd love your feedback, and I hope to share some notes afterwards. So have a great evening, everybody, and Sue and Brad, have a lovely day, and thank you for getting up so early.